Hello, welcome to Vintage Soup, where I sort of review and look at the history behind some films from before 1970. If you haven't seen my face before, my name is Carrie and I'll be taking a wee stroll down memory lane and reviewing the first silent film I ever saw, 1925's The Phantom of the Opera. So the basic story of The Phantom of the Opera involves young soprano Christine Daae, who becomes the object of obsession for the enigmatic, disfigured and insane genius Eric, who lives beneath the Paris Opera House. Unfortunately for Eric, Christine's childhood friend Raoul is on the scene and intent on marrying her. Meanwhile, a series of mysterious disasters befall the Opera House, culminating in murder and a chandelier falling into the auditorium. The events are attributed to the opera ghost, and of course he and Eric are one and the same. Eric kidnaps Christine and threatens to kill everyone if she doesn't marry him, before being chased down by a torch-wielding mob. Universal produced The Phantom of the Opera. It's arguably the genesis of the legendary horror films that the studio would create over the following decades. By the 1920s, Universal Studios was one of the most established and most prominent studios in Hollywood. However, Universal wasn't considered the most prestigious of studios, mostly churning out cheap westerns and serials. Studio head Carl Laemmle was a prudent operator and funded all the films himself, which explains the less than impressive films that were produced. However, there were some diamonds amongst the stones, thanks to Laemmle's talented and incredibly young studio chief, Irving Thalberg. Universal produced films that settled into three different tiers, the top one being the annual lavish jewel productions, which included prestigious works like Erich von Stroheim's Blind Husbands and his 1922 film Foolish Wives, which was famously advertised as the first $1 million movie, basically turning the studio's alarm at von Stroheim's extravagant spending into publicity. Thalberg also lured the respected and prominent character actor Lon Chaney back to the studio. Either Thalberg or Chaney fought for Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame to be brought to the big screen. The result was Universal's biggest hit to date, and it turned Lon Chaney into a global superstar. While Hunchback was in production, Laemmle travelled to Paris and there met Gaston Leroux, a one-time law student and journalist. Leroux was renowned in Europe as a detective writer, a sort of French Arthur Conan Doyle, even though many of his mysteries haven't had the same longevity, and The Phantom of the Opera being his one work that has survived into modern culture. At the Paris Opera House on the 20th of May 1896, two 360-kilogram counterweights fell from the chandelier, killing a 56-year-old woman. This real-life tragedy served as an inspiration for Leroux and was initially published in a serial format in 1909 before it was novelised in 1910 and was a modest hit in France as well as Germany and Britain. The book is often categorised as a potboiler, blending mystery with gothic romance. There's an obvious comparison with Beauty and the Beast. Also, in the early 20th century, there was a popular trend for the master criminal to act as the protagonist. Leroux contemporaries Marcel Allen and Pierre Silvestre created the highly popular and influential Fantomas, while the manipulative, mysterious Svengali in George du Maurier's Trilby features the villain dominating a young girl and turning her into a famous singer. The Phantom of the Opera had already been adapted for film in 1916, a German production that is now lost. By the time Carl Laemmle had met Leroux, the French author had become a film producer, sharing something in common with Universal's president. Whilst conversing with Leroux about the beauty of the Paris Opera House, the author gave Laemmle a copy of Phantom of the Opera, and Laemmle immediately realised the cinematic possibilities of the story, especially as his studio had an impressive Paris set already built from Hunchback. By the time The Phantom of the Opera went into production, boy genius Irving Thalberg had left for the fledgling rival MGM, so it was left to Laemmle to make creative decisions, which didn't always yield the best results. Laemmle's choice for director was Rupert Julian, at that point in the studio's good graces as he managed to economically complete von Stroheim's Merry-Go-Round after the director was fired. Julian's demand was Lon Chaney or it couldn't be done. The freelance actor signed up, having already been interested in the role years before. Unfortunately for Chaney and the rest of the cast and crew, the director was Rupert Julian. Julian was wholly despised. In 1918, the actor-director had starred, written and directed the propagandist melodrama The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin, which for some reason resulted in Julian developing an authoritarian air and Prussian mannerisms. Chaney had a small supporting role in the lost film, and his disdain for Julian grew from there. Chaney insisted that Charles Van Enger be hired as the cameraman, what we would now call a cinematographer. It was he that would latterly recall his role as liaison between Chaney and Julian when communications had broken down between the two. The cameraman said, "I used to carry messages. Julian would tell me to tell Chaney to do something, and Chaney would say, 'Tell him to go to hell. I'll do it the way I want to do it.'" Norman Kerry, who played Raoul, had also experience working with Julian. He had immediately come from Merry Go Round and felt similar animosity towards the director, even attempting to run him down with his horse. Decades later, Van Enger would demonstrate Julian's incompetence by reminiscing that the director demanded the scene be shot in complete darkness during the famous chandelier fall, clearly not understanding the absolute necessity for light, especially in a purely visual format such as silent film.
The chandelier is supposed to fall in darkness. Well, how the hell can you show something in the dark? And when the lights went out, everything went out but the Cooper Hewitts, which was a soft glow light. And the lights go out. With someplace around the lot, I had picked up a blue poker chip. And we used to have a blue glass that we'd look through for contrast. And we had a rehearsal, and Julian says, "You gonna have light on this scene?" I said, "Why?" He said, "I want it absolutely black." I said, "That'll be black." He said, "Let me see your blue glass." I gave him this blue poker chip, and he looked at it. He said, "Just what I want." Well, you know what they'd have done to me if I shot that thing in the dark and you couldn't see what happened, that chandelier falling?
In January 1925, the film was previewed and Universal knew it was an incoherent mess. They were specifically unhappy with the ending. Originally, the Phantom's heart gives out after Christine kisses him, reflecting the book's ending. This was the ending Chaney preferred, as it aligned with the sympathetic performances he was renowned for. However, those that saw the preview believed that Christine would never kiss such a monster, and the murdering Phantom didn't get his comeuppance. The original ending is lost, though some stills exist, and there are a couple of YouTube channels that have attempted to reconstruct it. Laemmle cancelled the planned New York premiere and ordered reshoots. Julian was promptly fired and replaced with Edward Sedgwick, mostly known for his comedic work. A dynamic high-speed chase through the streets of Paris, which sees the Phantom tracked down by a torch-wielding mob before they catch him, beat him to a pulp, and chuck him into the Seine River like a bag of bricks. The original structure of the film contrasts with what we were eventually given, with much more story told in flashbacks, which echoed the serialised and epistolary nature of the book. Various editors tinkered with the film, including Louis Weber, one of the most prominent pioneers of early cinema. Eventually, the film would premiere on the 6th of September 1925. Critics hailed Chaney's masterful performance, his makeup, and the film's art design, but were not enthusiastic about the action or the pacing or the plot. Despite this, The Phantom of the Opera was a huge box office hit and was the 6th most popular film in 1926. It proved to please crowds around the world, except for Britain, where it was banned. This resulted from Universal's UK office hoodwinking the military into providing an armed guard for the film reels when they were transferred to London. A marketing stunt that rattled many politicians' cages. This original 1925 cut is available but is incredibly scratchy and slightly warped. However, it expands on Christine and Raoul's relationship and is arguably the most coherent. With the coming of sound, Universal decided to re-release Phantom of the Opera 4 years later with a soundtrack. Universal once again wanted reshoots. By this time, Lon Chaney was contracted to MGM and couldn't, and probably wouldn't, return. Feldman and Norman Kerry did return and recorded some dialogue scenes. The soundtrack is available, but the visuals, except for one reel, are not. Mary Fabian, a professional opera singer, was brought on to play Carlotta. Therefore, the opera scenes were remade, with the 1925 Carlotta scenes being repurposed, with the 1925 Carlotta, Virginia Pearson, now acting as Carlotta's mother. For the foreign market and cinemas that had not yet fitted sound equipment, to coincide with the synchronised sound release, another silent edition was assembled, incorporating some of the new footage and also alternative takes from the original release. We can see this, for example, in the unmasking scene. Later restorations relied on the 1929 reissue as it's sharper, cleaner, and incorporated the glorious Technicolor sequences at the masked ball. Though there are inconsistencies, the alternative takes are not necessarily the most effective, and Christine's fate is unclear. Are we to presume that she died after she fell out the carriage? I first saw this film 35 years ago. God, I'm old. And it was in the months after Andrew Lloyd Webber's infamous musical production premiered in London. I constantly listened to the LP about 3 times a day. I was 7, so when Channel 4 broadcast the film, I was guaranteed to be watching it, even though I was warned it was a silent. What happened is it awakened my interest to silent film and classic horror, especially the films made by Universal, and that love has only endured and grown long after my enthusiasm for the musical has faded. Revisiting the film now, I understand it isn't perfect. Certain scenes can be plodding, even potentially exciting scenes adapted from the book are visually and dramatically flat. The blame for this is on Julian, who seemed to enjoy dramatising scenes straight on, shooting the proscenium arch, and offered no interesting angles or close-ups. However, there are a few flashes of filmmaking brilliance on display. The use of shadow and light shows Hollywood dabbling with expressionist technique and is credited to Charles Van Enger having worked with Ernst Lubitsch and becoming familiar with European technique. The set design is legendary. The 5-storey replica of the Paris Opera House auditorium was originally constructed on stage 28 on the Universal backlot. In its day, it was one of the most extensive sets ever built. Made of concrete, it would be used in several films into the 1980s until stage 28 was demolished in 2014 to make way for a Transformers ride. Though the studio reassures fans that the actual set is in storage. Art director Ben Carré, who had once worked at the Opera House, was engaged to design what would now be called concept art. Carré's work was meant to aid the struggling writers as they had problems visualising Leroux's descriptions. However, official art director Charles D. Hall incorporated them into the designs of the set, something Carré wouldn't be aware of for years. Along with Archer Hall, his brother, Hall not only recreated accurate replicas of the Paris Opera House, but also an imaginative backstage, haunting underground lair, as well as 7 blocks of Parisian streets. This heightened Gothic aesthetic would be the basis of the iconic Universal horror look. The supporting cast were made up of reliable performers. Snitz Edwards is the comic relief as Florine Papillon, who shudders in terror with the randomly spinning ballerinas, one of whom is the lovely Carla Laemmle, niece of Carl. The humour can be a little archaic with hokey slapstick galore, but it's not excessive or frankly as irritating as the latter Universal horror's use of comedy. Gibson Gowland as Simon Bouquet is remembered chiefly for his leading role as Matigue in Greed and is underutilised here. He plays the brother of the murdered stagehand Joseph Bouquet and discovers the Phantom's hiding place, an incident that happens off screen and seems a bit contrived. Arthur Edmund Carew is suitably mysterious as Ledoux, sometimes credited as the Persian. The Persian is a popular and influential character in the book, but is often excised in other film versions. In this adaptation, his role seems to have been abridged, and the revelation that he is secret police is messy, though he is still a man of action, unlike Raoul. Norman Kerry was a prominent leading man at Universal, though this is somewhat baffling to a modern audience as he's more of a mustachioed plank of wood than an actor. In the 1925 cut, there is more of a backstory between Christine and Raoul, but they still lack chemistry. Behind the scenes, Kerry had the old wandering palms, and Philbin latterly claimed she had to fight him off, even as the camera rolled. When not trying to grope his co-star, Kerry stands about as if he's waiting for a bus, or just looks awkward. Unfortunately, the ineffective romantic lead would become a staple of early Universal horror films. When 16-year-old Mary Philbin won a local beauty contest, her next-door neighbour sent her photo to his brother, Carl Laemmle, and she was promptly signed to Universal. Philbin was a bit part player. Then she was cast as the female protagonist in von Stroheim's Merry-Go-Round. Philbin was a favourite of Laemmle's, mostly because she had become a family friend, and Carl was notorious for giving people jobs if they were related or based on friendship. At one point, he apparently had 70 family members on the payroll. Philbin was beautiful and apparently a lovely person, but she struggled as an actress. Her best performance by far is in The Man Who Laughs, but she had the combination of a talented director and generous co-star. In Phantom, her performance is lackluster and awkwardly theatrical. She seems to miss a beat when it comes to reactions, and more than most silent performers, it seems apparent that she is receiving instructions as the camera rolls. In her defence, she had to fight off a randy leading man, as well as Rupert Julian. If the Phantom of the Opera is to be remembered for anything, it's Lon Chaney. Famously, the actor designed his makeup, hugely inspiring later makeup artists from Jack Pierce to Stan Winston, and his work as Eric would go down in film history. The moment Christine unmasked the Phantom is cited as one of the defining moments of silent cinema. Historians suggest that Chaney may have directed the scene. He also made sure that Mary Philbin hadn't seen his work beneath the mask. Chaney's stunned skeletal face screams down the lens, immediately connecting with and stunning the audience first, before spinning round and terrorising Christine. Apparently a genuine reaction from Philbin. It's still jolting to an audience and deserves its place in cinema history. Chaney's talent and commitment to makeup remain phenomenal, especially when you realise the intense pain he endured in many of his films. Films like 1920's The Penalty had Chaney play a bilateral amputee by strapping his lower legs to his back. With The Phantom of the Opera, Chaney faced arguably his greatest makeup challenge, closely basing it on LaRue's original description. He has no nose, and his eyes are sunken so deep in his skull that all that is seen are two eye sockets, except when his yellow eyes glow in the dark. His skin is yellowed and tightly stretched across his bones, and only a few wisps of dark brown hair are behind his ears and on his forehead. Chaney perfectly created Eric's skull-like face, and nothing in the past 96 years has come close to the effectiveness of Chaney's Phantom. Not Jack Pierce's design for Claude Rains, or Hammer's Herbert Lom, or Gerard Butler's effort. With The Phantom of the Opera, the publicity avoided any images of Chaney's phantom face. However, Universal made sure that the press would print stories about women fainting or screaming when the Phantom's face was revealed. Chaney kept much of his makeup techniques a secret, though experts believe the skull-like appearance was created by possibly gluing his ears down, building the cheekbones with cotton and collodion, and fastening prongs to false teeth. There are contrasting stories on how Chaney created the snout-like nose. Some say fish skin was applied to the bridge of the nose, others claim wires seem to have been used to pull the nostrils upward. Charles Van Enger would later testify that the nose would regularly bleed as a result of the makeup. However, the genius of Chaney was more than a box of makeup. Despite his association with horror, this is not an accurate representation of his film career. More often than not, Chaney would perform without elaborate makeup. For First and foremost, he was a character actor, and the makeup does not impede our interpretations of his performance. Chaney once said, "I wanted to remind people that the lowest types of humanity may have within them the capacity for supreme self-sacrifice. The dwarfed, misshapen beggar of the streets may have the noblest ideals." Chaney was always attracted to the misfits of society, the outcasts. His parents were deaf-mute, resulting in the other children bullying Lon and his siblings. As an adolescent, Chaney cared for his ill mother who had lost the ability to sign, so he communicated with her using pantomime, perfecting the art that would one day bring him fame. Chaney's face might be covered with a mask or under makeup in The Phantom of the Opera, but the character captivates. He expresses himself employing every part of his body, even as a silhouette, and yes, that is Chaney performing. He draws us in. He is gentle and almost submissive towards Christine when he cowers before her. His hands are majestically employed to show his panache, pensiveness or cunning, and Chaney's performance can make us empathise with his pain but fear his madness. Despite its alterations and the abruptness of the ending, admittedly it is satisfying to see Phantom have one last laugh, that he has power over the mob for a brief moment. Chaney was more than the Phantom. He made over 150 films. Unfortunately, 2/3 of those are lost. But if anything, The Phantom of the Opera makes us want to seek out more of Chaney's work. When Chaney died in 1930, every major studio in Hollywood closed in respect, a true testament of the great esteem the actor was held in. The Phantom of the Opera is a film that has problems with lacklustre direction, poor pacing and some weak performances. Thanks to the art direction and the talent of Lon Chaney, this film has stood the test of time. For nearly 100 years, it has inspired generations of horror films, as well as one of the most successful musicals of all time. For many, Lon Chaney as the Phantom of the Opera is an introduction to silent film, and it will continue to be that for as long as there are cinema fans. If you made it this far into the video, thank you. I really appreciate it. It would be cool if you subscribed or press the like button. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it would be good for the old algorithm. But until next time, goodbye and have a great Halloween.